I don't care who you are, she said, gripping the bolt cutters until her knuckles went white. Nobody deserves to be left out here to die. The man chained to the fence stared at her, this 76-year-old woman, standing in the heat of a Montana summer, with her dead husband's tools in her hands, and he had absolutely nothing to say. He'd faced down rival clubs. He'd survived prison. He'd buried brothers, but he had never seen anything like Evelyn Carter. Before we go any further, if this story moves you the way it moved everyone who heard it, subscribe to this channel and follow along all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far the story travels. The bolt cutters were heavier than she remembered. Evelyn Carter hadn't touched them in 3 years, not since Harold passed, not since she'd stopped coming out to the old station as often as she used to. The tools lived in a rusted green box on the back shelf of the storage room. Harold's box, the one he'd kept organized with a precision that embarrassed most professional mechanics. Everything labeled, everything in its place. That was Harold. That was who she'd spent 44 years loving. She carried the bolt cutters in both arms, her shoulders already burning from the weight walking back across the cracked asphalt in 95-degree heat. The station sat off Route 12 about 8 miles east of Billings, just far enough from town that nobody passed through unless they meant to. Harold had built it with his own hands in 1979. The pump islands, the small office, the storage room with its tin roof that leaked every spring, no matter how many times he patched it. After he died, Evelyn couldn't bring herself to sell it, couldn't bring herself to do much of anything with it, so she'd kept the property taxes paid and driven out every few weeks just to sit in the old office chair and pretend for a little while that she could still smell his coffee. She almost hadn't stopped. Today, she'd been heading back toward town, her weekly errand run complete, and she'd turned into the station on pure muscle memory, the way you turn at an intersection you've used 10,000 times without thinking. She'd parked, she'd gone inside, she'd sat for 20 minutes listening to the wind move through the gaps in the walls, and she'd been about to leave when she heard it. Not a voice, not at first. A sound, something between a groan and a cough muffled by the back wall. The kind of sound a person makes when they've been making sounds for a long time, and their body has almost given up on it. Evelyn had stood very still, her hand on the doorframe, and listened. It came again. She'd thought about getting in her car. She'd thought about driving to the nearest gas station with a working phone line and calling the sheriff's department. Those would have been the sensible choices. She was 76 years old. She lived alone. She had no business walking toward an unexplained sound behind an abandoned building in the middle of nowhere. But Evelyn Carter had spent 44 years watching Harold walk toward things other people walked away from, and somewhere along the way, it had gotten into her bones. She went around back. The first thing she registered was the smell, sweat, and heat, and something metallic that she recognized from her years working the register while Harold ran the shop. Oil and blood. The second thing she registered was the chains. 4 men, wrists behind their backs, some of them with their arms looped through the gaps in the old chain-link fence that ran along the property line. Heavy chain, not rope, not zip ties. Chain the industrial kind secured with padlocks she could see even from 15 feet away. The men were sitting or half-slumped in various positions, their leather vests dark with sweat, their faces sunburned to a color that told her they'd been out here for a long time. Hours, maybe longer. She stood there for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Then the big one at the end opened his eyes. He was probably in his late 50s, built like someone who'd been large his whole life and had just gotten larger. Gray blonde hair pulled back, beard that had grown past his chest at some point and stayed there. His leather vest was faded in a way that said, "Years of road not fashion," and across the back of it, even from where she stood, she could read the words, "Hell's Angels." The bottom rocker said, "Montana." His eyes found her face, and instead of relief, what moved across his expression was something closer to alarm. "Ma'am," his voice was a wreck, cracked and dry, barely above a rasp. "You need to get back in your car and leave, right now." Evelyn didn't move. "Did you hear me?" He shifted, winced hard, went still again. "This isn't a situation you want to be involved in. These are club matters. Just go. Call nobody. Just drive away and forget you saw this." She looked at the other 3. One of them, younger, maybe early 30s, was barely conscious, his head drooping, his breathing shallow and fast. Another one was watching her with an expression she'd seen on animals that had been in traps long enough to stop expecting rescue. The fourth had his eyes closed and she couldn't tell if he was sleeping or something worse, and that thought moved through her chest like a cold wire. "How long have you been out here?" she asked. The big man bear, though she didn't know his name yet, stared at her. "Ma'am, please, I'm not going to ask again." "I'm not asking you for permission," Evelyn said. "I'm asking you a medical question. How long?" A pause. The wind moved. Somewhere in the distance, a truck downshifted on the highway. "Since last night," he said, "sometime after midnight." She did the math. It was now past 4 in the afternoon. They'd been chained to a fence in Montana's summer heat for 16 hours, possibly more. "Do any of you need a hospital?" "We don't go to hospitals." His voice had changed, not softer, but different somehow. Like he was recalibrating, trying to figure out what to do with a woman who wasn't running. "Not unless we're dying." The young one there looks like he might be getting close. Bear turned his head toward the younger man. Something moved through his face fast and then gone, the kind of expression you learn to hide young. When you grow up in places where showing it cost you. But she'd seen it. Fear, not for himself. "Danny," he said. "Hey, Danny." The young man's head lifted slightly. "Yeah," barely a word, more like an exhale. "Stay with me, brother. I'm here." Evelyn set the bolt cutters down, reached into her bag, and pulled out 2 bottles of water she hadn't finished from her errands. She walked forward, crouched down next to the young man, Danny, and held the water to his lips. He drank, coughed, drank more. Bear watched her without speaking. She moved to the next man, the one with the trapped animal eyes. He drank without making eye contact. Then to the fourth, who turned out to be awake, after all, just quiet. He said, "Thank you, ma'am," in a voice that didn't match his size or his tattoos, and she thought of Harold again, who had the same quality, a softness underneath the everything else that took you by surprise the first time you encountered it. She went back to the bolt cutters. "Those won't cut that chain," Bear said. "I'm aware it'll be hard." She positioned the bolt cutters around the first padlock hasp, the one closest to Danny, and set her feet. "Hard isn't the same as impossible." "Ma'am, my name is Evelyn," she said, and put her weight into it. The bolt cutter slipped. She repositioned, put her weight into it again. Her shoulders screamed. Her hands, already arthritic in the morning, burned with the effort. Nothing. She stopped, breathed, repositioned, and tried again. This time, she put everything she had into it all. 138 pounds of her, everything she'd carried since Harold died, and the house got quiet and the weeks started to blur together into one long act of enduring, and she felt something give. Not break, but give. Shift. The way a thing does when it's decided to come apart. The padlock didn't open, but the hasp itself buckled. One more push. The crack was sharp enough that all 4 men flinched. The chain fell away from Danny's wrists, and he made a sound she'd remember for a long time afterward, not relief exactly, but the absence of something. The stopping of a pain he'd been holding so long, he'd stopped registering it. "Okay," he said, "just that." "Okay." She moved to the next man. Bear watched her work. He didn't say anything else about leaving. He didn't say anything at all for a while. She could feel him processing something, the way you can feel a room change when the person in it changes their mind about something important. "You live around here?" he finally asked. "My husband built this station." She had the second lock position now. "I come out here sometimes." "Alone." "He passed 3 years ago." She pushed. Pain shot up her arms. She breathed through it. "We were married 44 years. A silence. "I'm sorry," Bear said. And he said it the way people say it when they mean it and don't have any better words, which is usually how you can tell the difference. The second hasp buckled. She gave it one more push, and it gave completely, and the second man's hands came free. He flexed his fingers slowly, mechanically, the way you do when you're not sure they still work. "Marcus," Bear said, "you good enough." Marcus's voice was steadier than his hands. He looked at Evelyn with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Ma'am, we don't usually," he stopped, started over. "Thank you." "Thank me when you're all loose," she said, and moved to the third. His name, she'd find out later, was Tomas. He was 43 years old, had been a member for 12 years, and had a daughter in Missoula who was 11 and who he coached in Little League every spring. In the moment, he didn't tell her any of that. He just watched her come toward him with the bolt cutters and said very quietly, You're not what I expected. I'd imagine not, Evelyn said. No, I mean, he shook his head. Never mind, you need help with the angle. If your hands were free, I'd take it. He almost smiled. Yeah. She got his chains off in 2 tries. Her hands were shaking now, not fear, but exhaustion, the deep kind that settles into your joints and doesn't leave quickly. She straightened up, rolled her shoulders, and went to Bear last. His locks were the heaviest. Whoever had chained them had clearly considered that Bear would be the most likely to break free given any opportunity, and they doubled up 2 padlocks through a double run of chain. His wrist crossed behind his back at an angle that had to have been agony after the first hour. She looked at it for a long moment. You can leave this one, Bear said. I mean that. You've done more than just leave me here and go get someone. And how long would that take? He didn't answer. Right. She positioned the bolt cutters on the first hasp. So let's not waste time. The first hasp took 4 attempts. Her hands were visibly trembling by the end of it, and she stood with her eyes closed for a few seconds, just breathing before moving to the second. Bear didn't say anything. He just waited, and something about the quality of his waiting, the stillness of it, the patience made her think of men she'd known who'd been in wars. Harold had been in Vietnam. He'd had that same quality sometimes, the ability to go somewhere inside themselves and wait. The second hasp gave on the third attempt, and Bear's hands came free, and he said nothing at all. He brought his arms forward, slowly, painfully, and held them in front of him for a moment, just looking at his own hands, like he was verifying they were still attached. Then he looked at her. Evelyn, he said, like he was testing the name. That's right. I'm Clay. Most people call me Bear. I know how that works, she said. Harold had a name like that. His friends called him Wolf. I never did figure out why. Bear almost laughed. It came out as something rougher than a laugh, but in the same neighborhood. Usually somebody gives you one. You don't always get a say. Evelyn had gone back to the storage room. She came out now with a first aid kit, also Harold's also labeled contents replaced last year, when she'd been going through his things and found the old 1 and 4 bottles of sports drink she kept in a small cooler for her long drives. She set everything on the old wooden cable spool Harold had used as an outdoor table. Drink first, she said. Slow. Don't chug it if you've been out here that long, you'll be sick. They drank. She watched them cataloging. Marcus had a cut on his arm that was dried and crusted, but not deep enough for stitches. Tomas had a bruised jaw that had purpled overnight. Danny's color was getting better with every few minutes of hydration. Bear had his right hand held at a slight angle that suggested he might have a broken finger, but he didn't mention it, and she decided to let him keep his dignity on that one for now. You said you were on your way back from somewhere, she said when she decided enough time had passed, before this happened. Bear looked at Marcus. Some communication passed between them, the kind that doesn't need words. Memorial Run, Bear said. We lost a brother last month, cancer, 49 years old. We went down to Wyoming to ride with his family, his chapter. We were coming back through when they jumped us. Who jumped you? Another exchange. This one longer. People who've been wanting to send us a message for a while, Bear said carefully. It's club business, Evelyn. I don't want to put you in the middle of it by explaining more than that. I understand. Are you in danger right now? Are they likely to come back? No, he said it with a certainty that told her he knew exactly how these things worked, and this particular action had been designed as a one-time humiliation, not a precursor. They made their point, or they thought they did. What was the point? He looked at her directly. That we're vulnerable, that we can be gotten to. And are you vulnerable? Bear looked down at his hands for a moment, at the red marks on his wrists where the chain had been. Any man can be, he said quietly. Anybody can be made to feel small if they catch you right, he paused. I don't know why I'm telling you that. Because I asked, Evelyn said simply, and because you've had a bad night and sometimes you just need someone to ask. He looked at her for a long moment, whatever he'd expected when he heard footsteps coming around the corner of that building. Another enemy, a random stranger who'd bolt someone who'd pull out a phone and make a call that would bring complications. It had not been this, a 76-year-old woman with bolt cutters and sports drinks, and the kind of directness that you usually only find in people who've been through enough that they've stopped seeing the point in indirectness. You said your husband built this place, Bear said. He did. You drive out here alone to look at it. Sometimes it's the place I feel closest to him still. She looked around at the cracked pumps, the faded sign with Harold's name on it, the storage room door hanging slightly crooked on its hinges. I know it's just a building, but 44 years of a life happened around it. Bear nodded. He understood something about places holding things that weren't really there anymore. He didn't say so. Some things you don't say. You just nod. Danny had recovered enough to be sitting upright on his own, his back against the fence, his eyes tracking. He'd been quiet since Evelyn freed him, not the unconscious quiet of before, but a thinking quiet. Now he spoke. Can I ask you something? Go ahead, Evelyn said. When you heard us, why didn't you just drive away? Most people would have. She thought about it. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because it deserved a real answer, not a quick one. I heard a sound, she said finally, and the sound was a person. And once I knew it was a person, I couldn't unknow it. She paused. Harold used to say, he said it 100 times, maybe more, that there's the moment before you decide, and then there's the moment after, and the only thing that matters is which one you have to live in. Once I heard you, I knew I'd have to live in the after. Danny stared at her. If I'd driven away, she continued, I'd have been going home to an empty house and a long night of sitting with what I did knowing I'd hurt a person and kept driving. At 76, you don't have so many years left that you can afford to spend them like that. The stillness that followed was the kind where several people are all thinking the same thing and none of them have the words for it yet. It was Tomas who broke it. He'd been quiet the longest. She'd noticed that about him, that he listened more than he talked, that he watched everything. You got a way home, he asked. My car's out front. Good, he paused. We're going to need to borrow your phone if you'll let us. Make one call and then we'll get out of your way. You're not in my way. She stood brushing the dust from her slacks. Make your call, then come inside and sit in the shade while you wait. It's too hot out here. She went back around to the front of the station. Behind her she heard Moss say to Bear quietly, but not quietly enough. She's something else. And Bear said, yeah. She pretended she hadn't heard that either. Inside the old office, she put the coffee maker on. It still worked. She'd kept the electricity connected, kept the small refrigerator running, kept everything in the kind of maintenance that is really just a refusal to let go. While the coffee brewed, she sat in Harold's chair. Her chair, now she supposed, though she'd never been able to say that naturally, and looked at the photograph on the wall. Harold at the opening of the station, 1979. He was 31 years old. He had his arm around a woman who was 27 and didn't know yet that this would be the center of 44 years of her life. Not the building, but the man standing beside it. He was grinning like someone who just pulled off the greatest heist of his life, which was what he always said owning your own business felt like. She heard footsteps on the asphalt. Bear appeared in the doorway. He'd taken the moment while she was inside to do what he could, hair back, vest straightened, the kind of presentation adjustments that don't fix anything but tell you something about a person's pride. He had his right hand, the one with the possibly broken finger, tucked slightly against his side. Come in, she said. Coffee's almost ready. He came in. He stood for a moment looking at the space at the old register that hadn't worked since the late 90s, at the hand-lettered signs Harold had made at the photograph on the wall, with the expression of someone who walks into a room and immediately understands the history of it. Your husband, he said, looking at the photograph. Harold Carter, 44 years. He looks like somebody worth missing. Evelyn poured coffee. He was the best person I ever knew. Most honest man you'd ever meet, not just with other people, with himself. A lot of people can't manage that. He always could. Bear accepted the coffee mug she handed him with both hands, the careful, formal way of someone raised to be respectful, who has been called disrespectful his whole life anyway. He drank. Good coffee, he said. Harold taught me. He used to say the coffee at the station was the reason people came back. I was probably right. They stood for a moment in the comfortable silence of two people who have, without planning, gotten to a level of honesty with each other that usually takes a long time to reach. Outside, she could hear the other three men's voices, low, steady. The kind of conversation that happens when people are checking in on each other without making a production of it. How's your finger? She asked. Bear looked at his right hand. The middle finger was swollen noticeably at the second knuckle, darkening toward purple. He looked at her. What did I say about hard not being the same as impossible? She said. He actually laughed at that, a real one. She went to Harold's first aid kit, found the tape and the splint materials, and set them on the counter. Bear held his hand out without being asked. She taped the finger middle to ring the way Harold had shown her when he'd broken two of his own in a garage accident in '91 and worked carefully, her arthritis making her slower than she wanted to be, but accurate. Your husband teach you that too, Bear asked. He broke his hand twice and his fingers more times than either of us kept track of. Eventually you learn out of necessity. She finished the tape, cut it. There, not perfect, but it'll hold until you can get it looked at. Bear flexed his other fingers carefully. Thank you, a pause. Evelyn, I want to ask you something. Ask. Why are you being this kind to us? She set down the tape, looked at him. Why wouldn't I be? He stopped, tried again. Most people see what we are before they see what we are, if you understand what I mean. They see the vest, the reputation. They make decisions before they even look at our faces. You came around that corner and you saw four people who needed help. Most people don't do that. Most people, Evelyn said, are afraid of things they don't understand. I was afraid too, but I heard a sound that was a person, and I've told you why I couldn't let that go. She paused. Besides, Harold used to say that the worst thing you can do to someone is decide you know who they are before you've let them tell you. Bear was quiet for a long moment. He really was something, he finally said. The best. Outside the sound of vehicles, distant growing. She looked up. Bear's expression shifted, focused, alert, the way you go when you've been in situations where arriving vehicles could mean either rescue or a second problem. That's our ride, he said. The tension dropped out of his shoulders. Marcus appeared at the door. 2 trucks 10 minutes out. Chapter VP is driving the first one. Good. Bear set down his coffee mug. He looked at Evelyn. We're going to need to get out of your way. Get cleaned up, figure out what we're doing next. I understand. I mean it about the club business. It would be better if this stays between us. You saw 4 men having a bad day, you helped, they left. Nothing more than that. Evelyn looked at him steadily. I'm a 76-year-old widow who comes out to her late husband's gas station to drink coffee alone. I promise you I'm not going to be calling the evening news. Bear almost smiled. No, I guess not. He picked up his coffee mug again, drank the last of it, set it back down with a kind of deliberateness. For what it's worth, he said, I've been in this club going on 30 years. I've been in situations I'd rather not have been in. I've had people help me, and I've had people turn their back. He paused. I have never had someone do what you did today, the way you did it. Evelyn said nothing. I'm going to remember this, Bear said. We're going to remember this. And somehow, standing in Harold's old station with the afternoon light, coming in sideways, and the sound of trucks getting louder, on the highway, those words landed differently than they might have otherwise. Not as a threat, not as a promise exactly, as a fact, stated plainly by a man who had learned somewhere along the way that there aren't very many facts worth stating. She walked them out front. The 2 trucks pulled into the lot, and 6 men got out, moving with urgency that slowed the moment they saw that things were stable. Recalibrating instantly the way people do when they've spent years walking into uncertain situations and learning to read them fast. The man from the first truck, younger than Bear, leaner, a scar running from jaw to ear, stopped when he saw Evelyn. He looked at Bear. He looked back at Evelyn. Who's this? He said. Evelyn Carter, Bear said. She owns the property. She boigu. He stopped, looked at the bolt cutters still lying near the corner of the building, looked at Evelyn's hands, the redness, the slight trembling she hadn't quite gotten rid of yet. The math wasn't complicated. She cut you loose. All 4 of us, Tomas said behind him. By herself. The man from the first truck stared at her for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, ma'am. Just that, like it was the only word that fit. She loaded the bolt cutters back into the truck, accepted help from Danny carrying the cooler, even though she hadn't asked for it, and watched them load up and pull back onto the highway. Bear was the last one in. He stopped with his hand on the truck door and looked back at her. She raised a hand. He raised his. Then they were gone, and the lot was quiet again, and it was just Evelyn Carter in Harold's old station and the late afternoon heat and the sound of a semi working its way up the grade a mile north. She stood there for a while. Then she went inside, washed her hands, poured what was left of the coffee into her travel mug, and started the drive home. She didn't tell anyone about it that night. She made her dinner soup, the same soup she'd been making every Monday for 15 years. And she sat in Harold's chair in the living room, and she thought about what had happened, the way you think about something when you're still not sure if it was real. 4 men chained to a fence, Bolt cutters, a broken padlock hasp falling on cracked asphalt, the sound Danny made when his hands came free. She thought about what Bear had said. I have never had someone do what you did today. The way you did. She thought about what she'd told them. Once I knew it was a person, I couldn't unknow it. Outside, the Montana night was coming in quiet and dark, the way it always did, the way it had every night of her life out here. She finished her soup. She rinsed the bowl. She turned off the lights in the kitchen. And then on the way to bed, she stopped in the hallway where Harold's photograph hung, the one from their anniversary, 20 years, and both of them still looking at each other like they'd just figured something out. Interesting day, she told him. The photograph didn't answer. But she felt for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, like something had shifted, not in the world, in her. Like some door that had been closing slowly since the morning. She woke up and reached across the bed and found it cold, like that door had today opened a crack. She went to bed. She slept better than she had in months. She didn't expect to hear from them again. That wasn't naivety, it was just the math of the situation. 4 men a bad day, a stranger with bolt cutters. People move on from bad days. They go back to their lives and the story becomes something they tell occasionally, the way you tell the story of the time your car broke down in the middle of nowhere and some stranger pulled over something you were grateful for, but that doesn't change the direction you were already traveling. She'd helped them. They'd gone. That was a complete thing. She kept driving out to the station. She kept making her soup on Mondays. She kept talking to Harold's photograph in the way you keep doing things that don't make rational sense, because grief doesn't run on rational sense. It runs on its own schedule and you learn to work around it. 3 days passed. On the 4th day, her phone rang. She almost didn't answer it. The number wasn't one she recognized, a Montana area code, but not a number in her contacts. And at 76, she developed a reasonable policy about unknown numbers that mostly involved letting them go to voicemail, but something made her pick up. She'd think about that later, the impulse that made her reach for it. Is this Evelyn Carter? A man's voice. Not Bear. Younger, tighter. It is. Who's this? My name is Reese. I'm the vice president of the Montana Charter of the Hells Angels. I was driving the first truck that came to pick up Bear and the others 4 days ago. She remembered him. The scar. The quiet man that had said everything. I remember you, she said. I wanted to call and check on you. Make sure that you hadn't had any trouble since. She hadn't. She told him so. Good. A pause. He had the voice of someone who makes calls like this regularly, the kind where you're responsible for people, and you have to verify they're okay even when you already half know they are. Bear told me what you did, all of it, how you found them, what you used, how long it took. Another pause longer. I don't know if anybody told you, but Danny, the youngest one, his core temperature, when we got him to a doctor, was high enough that another hour out there would have been serious. Maybe worse than serious. Evelyn sat down. She hadn't known that. He's fine now, Reese said quickly. Hydrated, rested. He's 28 years old and he bounces back fast. But I wanted you to know that because what you did wasn't just kind, it was the difference. She found she didn't have an immediate response to that. Is there anything you need, Reese asked. Anything at the property out there, or Bear mentioned the station's been closed a while. If there's anything that needs fixing or... I appreciate that, she said carefully. But I'm not looking for anything in return. I know you're not. That's not why I'm offering. She thought about the tin roof that leaked every spring, the pump island with the cracked concrete that she'd meant to get repaired for 2 years, the storage room door that hung crooked and sometimes caught in the wind and banged all night. Things Harold would have fixed, things she kept meaning to get around to. I'll think about it, she said. That's all I'm asking. He gave her his number. She wrote it on the notepad she kept by the phone, the same notepad she'd had for 6 years. Harold's handwriting still on the first few pages in faded pencil. She wrote Reese beneath Harold's grocery list and didn't examine too closely how that felt. 2 more days passed. On the 6th day, she drove out to the station like she always did, and when she came around the building to the back fence, the one with the rust marks where the chains had been, she stood there for a moment. She told herself she was checking the fence post, that one of them had looked loose for a while, and she should see about getting it set properly. That was true. It was also not the whole truth. She stood where they'd been and thought about 16 hours in 95-degree heat in a 28-year-old whose temperature had been high enough that another hour might have been worse than serious. Then she went inside and called Reese back. The roof, she said, in the storage room roof. It's leaked every spring for about 10 years and I've been putting it off. I'll have people there by Friday, he said. No negotiation. No, well, let me see what I can do. Just a declarative sentence of someone who is used to organizing things. I'm not looking for charity. It's not charity. It's four guys who are very good at roofing and who have been told they're doing this. A beat. Bear's going to be one of them. He asked to be. She hadn't expected that. All right, she said. All right, Reese said, and she could hear something in his voice that wasn't quite a smile but was in the same neighborhood. They showed up Friday morning, not 4-7. Bear Thomas Danny looking fully recovered and embarrassed about that. The way young men get embarrassed when you've seen them at anything less than full capacity. And four others she hadn't met, all in work clothes instead of leather, all carrying tools, all behaving with a focused efficiency that told her this wasn't the first time they'd shown up somewhere and fixed something that needed fixing. She made coffee. Bear came in first after they'd unloaded, still in that particular way he had of taking stock of a space before he entered it fully. He looked at the coffee maker. He looked at the mug she'd put out. He looked at her. You made extra, he said. I made a full pot, she said. I didn't know how many drank it. All of us. Every chance we get. He poured a mug. How have you been? The same, quiet. She paused. Reese told me about Danny. Bear nodded. He didn't look away. I'm glad I stopped, she said simply. I would have been glad regardless, but I'm glad I stopped when I did. Yeah, he wrapped both hands around the mug. Me too, a pause. Danny wants to say something to you. He practiced it, keeps messing it up. I told him to just say whatever comes out, but he's 28 and he has ideas about how things should go. She almost smiled. Send him in when he's ready. He'll be ready eventually. Bear drank his coffee. He's also the best one with a tin roof, which is why I brought him. So he's currently trying to decide if he should work first and talk later, or talk first and then work. Tell him to work first. The roof matters. That's what I said. He set the mug down and headed back out. He stopped in the doorway. Evelyn. Yes. I told Bear what Reese told me. He said thank you, and then he didn't say anything else for about an hour. He paused. That's the most I've ever heard Clay Dawson not say anything. Just so you know what you did. She thought about that after he left. She refilled her own coffee and thought about it until she heard the first boots on the roof and the efficient sounds of men who know how to work taking apart what needed taking apart. Danny came in an hour later breathing like he'd been moving fast still in his work gloves. He stood in the doorway the way Bear had that same stock-taking posture, and then he took off the gloves and folded them and said, I don't have a speech. I tried to write one and it sounded like something from a greeting card. I don't need a speech, Evelyn said. I know, but I need to say something. He looked at his folded gloves. I was in bad shape out there. By the end, I wasn't thinking clearly anymore. I could hear the others talking to me, but I couldn't always make out what they were saying. And then I heard footsteps and I thought, he stopped. I thought it was them coming back, the guys who did it. And I remember thinking, okay, this is going to be bad. And then I heard your voice and it was, he looked up. It didn't sound like what I expected. It sounded like someone's grandmother. I am someone's grandmother, Evelyn said. 3 grandchildren, Denver, Phoenix, and 1 in Portland. He almost laughed. Right, yeah. He took a breath. I just mean when I realized what was happening, that it was you and what you were doing and why. It hit me in a way I wasn't ready for. He paused again. My grandmother passed when I was 14. She was the kind of person who she just did the right thing all the time, like it wasn't even a decision. He looked at her. That's what I thought about when I heard you out there, that she would have done exactly what you did. Evelyn looked at this 28-year-old man with his folded work gloves and his abandoned speech and his grandmother he'd lost at 14, and she felt something that she didn't have a precise word for. It lived somewhere between aching and grateful. She sounds like she was a good woman, Evelyn said. The best one I knew. He cleared his throat. Anyway, thank you, that's the whole speech. It was a good speech, she said. He grinned. It changed his whole face, made him look about 16. He went back out and she heard him back on the roof inside of 2 minutes. And she thought about how the young ones always move like that, like the body's impatient with the time the heart needs. They worked all day. By 3 in the afternoon, the roof was done properly, done with new flashing and sealed seams, and the kind of thoroughness that comes from people who take pride in the work itself, not just the completion. While the roof crew worked, two of the others had fixed the storage room door without being asked, adjusting the hinges so it hung straight and latched clean. Someone had patched the cracked concrete on the pump island. Someone else had found the broken security light she'd meant to replace and replaced it. She hadn't mentioned any of those things. They just walked around the property and seen what needed doing and done it. At 4 o'clock, she made sandwiches from what she'd brought, more than she'd needed for just herself, and set them on Harold's cable spool. 7 large men in various states of grime sat around it and ate and talked in the way of people who are comfortable with each other. The easy, loud, comfortable talk that reminded her so much of Harold's crew back in the day that it made her chest tighten in the good way. Bear sat beside her. He ate half a sandwich in approximately 30 seconds and then spent a moment appearing to contemplate the second half with great ethical seriousness before eating that too. "What made you stay open so long?" he asked. "The station, before it closed." "Harold." She said it simply because it was simply true. He loved it the way some men love a thing they made. It was his, and that mattered to him. "We kept it going until the highway expansion took most of the traffic north in 2009, and then it just stopped making sense." She looked around. "He kept the building, though. Couldn't sell it. I understood that. I feel the same." "Some places are just yours," Bear said. "Yes. I've got a place like that. Old property up near Glacier. Belonged to my grandfather. I go there when I need to remember what things are supposed to feel like." He was quiet for a moment. "Lost it for a while. Legal trouble back in the 90s. Spent 6 years thinking I'd never get it back." He drank from the water bottle she'd brought. "Then I did. And the day I got the deed back, I drove up there and just sat on the porch for about 4 hours and didn't do anything at all." Evelyn looked at him. "6 years is a long time to carry something," she said. "Yeah, but you carry what you carry." He looked at the building. Harold sounded like a man who would have understood that. He would have. He was good at carrying things quietly. She paused. "Too quiet sometimes. I used to have to drag it out of him. He'd carry something for months without saying a word, and then one night he'd just say it, all at once, and I'd realize I'd been watching him carry it the whole time and hadn't known the shape of it." She smiled a little. "We worked that out eventually. Took about 15 years. Bear made a sound that was half laugh, half something more rueful. 15 years sounds about right for that kind of lesson. The afternoon was getting long. The crew began loading up, efficient about it, everything repacked the way it came out. Evelyn walked the property with Bear. While the others finished up, he wanted to show her what they'd done, explain what to watch for on the roof through the first rain where they'd found the weak spots. She listened. She'd always been a good listener. Harold had called it her secret power, the way she could make a person feel like whatever they were saying was the most interesting thing said all day. It wasn't performance. She was actually interested. People's knowledge of things, what they knew and why they knew, it had always seemed to her one of the genuinely inexhaustible subjects of the world. Bear knew roofing the way Harold had known engines, from the inside, with the vocabulary of someone who'd learned not from a manual, but from doing it wrong first and then right. "You've done a lot of this," she said. "Club does volunteer work, fix-it projects, community stuff. It doesn't make the news usually." A slight dryness in his voice. "The other stuff tends to make the news." "What other stuff?" He looked at her sideways. "You know what other stuff?" "I know what people say. Some of it's true," he said. "I won't tell you it isn't. We've had members who've done things I wouldn't defend. I've done things I wouldn't completely defend." He stopped walking. "But there's also," he stopped again, tried again. "We take care of each other. We take care of people around us. We show up when people need showing up. That part doesn't fit the story people want to tell, so it doesn't get told." Evelyn nodded. "Harold had a crew like that once," she said. "Not bikers. He ran a volunteer fire department for 11 years. And people respected them, loved them, were grateful for them. But 2 of those men had records. One of them had been in prison. And there were people in town who could never get past that, to see the men who showed up when your house was burning." She paused. "It used to make Harold so angry." Bear looked at her. "What did he do with the angry?" "He put it into showing up more," she said. "He figured the only way to change a story was to write over it. Keep going out. Keep doing the work. Give people something else to look at. Bear was quiet for a long moment. He was smarter than most, he finally said. He was. I told him so every chance I got. She smiled. He pretended it embarrassed him. It never did. They finished the walkthrough. The crew was loaded engines starting. Bear stood at the truck, and she stood on the station side, and there was the brief, awkward geography of a goodbye between people who have slid unexpectedly into something that doesn't have a pre-existing name. I know Reese offered to help if anything else needs doing, Bear said. He did. I want you to actually call, not just think about calling, actually call. He said it with the directness of someone who has watched people not ask for help until the moment when it's too late to ask. The lights on the pylon, the wiring's older than it should be. I'd want someone to look at that before winter. I'll call, she said. Good. He nodded once. Then Evelyn, can I ask you something? You already asked me that once, she said. The answer is still yes. He almost smiled. When we were back there, chained up, and I told you to leave, you didn't even hesitate. No. Why not most people there's at least a moment where they weigh it, whether it's worth the trouble. She thought about it carefully. Because the weighing was already done, she said. By the time I got the bolt cutters and came back, I'd already decided. The walking back was just the carrying out of the decision. What made the decision? She was quiet for a moment. I used to ask Harold that, about the times he ran into burning buildings. Because he wasn't fearless, I knew him too well to believe that. He was afraid. But he went anyway. And I asked him once, I said, Harold, how do you make yourself do it? And he said, she paused, hearing his voice as clear as the day he'd said it. He said, Evelyn, I don't make myself do it. I just don't make myself not do it. The sound of engines, wind in the high grass beyond the fence, Bear's face in the last of the afternoon light, something moving behind his eyes that was too complex to name. I don't make myself not do it, he repeated. That's the whole thing, as she said. That's all it ever is. He stood there another moment. Then he nodded the kind of nod that means I'm going to be thinking about that for a while, and got in the truck. She watched them pull out. She stood in the quiet of the empty lot for a few minutes after they were gone. The storage room door swung open and shut easily properly in the wind. The roof didn't creak in the places it used to creak. The pump island concrete was whole and level. The security light at the corner was ready for nightfall. She thought Harold would have liked those men. She thought he would have invited them in and kept them there for hours. She thought he would have asked Bear about the property near Glacier, and he would have listened the same way she had, with that particular quality of attention that made a person feel like their story mattered. She went inside and washed the sandwich plates and the coffee mugs and stood at the small window over the sink for a while, looking out at the lot, the way Harold used to stand there and look out at the highway, watching for people who might be on their way. She didn't know yet what was coming. She had no way of knowing. She was a 76-year-old woman in a repaired building in Montana, washing dishes in the quiet of late afternoon, thinking about a man she missed every single day of her life. But somewhere in a phone call she wasn't party to, in a conversation she'd never hear the original of, something had already been set in motion. Bear had called Reese from the truck. He'd said, tell me everything went right with the roof. Reese said it had. Bear said good. Then after a pause that Reese would later describe as the longest 3 seconds of any phone call he'd ever been on. I want you to tell the story at the next council meeting. All of it. What she did, how she did it, what she said. Reese was quiet. You want me to? All of it, Bear said. The bolt cutters, Danny's temperature, what she said about not making yourself not do it. His voice had something in it that was difficult to categorize. Quiet but not calm, still but not settled. I want every man in that room to hear exactly what a 76-year-old woman with arthritis and her dead husband's tools did for 4 of us, that nobody else in that area would have even slowed down for. He paused. I want them to sit with that. Reese sat with it himself for a moment. Okay, he said. When's the meeting? 10 days. I'll have it ready. The call ended. On her end, Evelyn Carter dried her dishes, put them away in the precise order Harold had established in 1991, turned off the light over the sink, and drove home through the Montana evening with the windows down, because the air had finally cooled to something human, and she was thinking about 3 grandchildren. She hadn't called in too long, and meaning to fix that, and she was thinking about a storage room door that finally hung straight, and she was thinking about a young man with folded work gloves and an abandoned speech about his grandmother. She was not thinking about council meetings. She was not thinking about 10 days from now. She had no reason to. The 10 days passed the way. Montana days pass wide and full of sky and weather that changes its mind 3 times before noon. She called her grandchildren. She drove out to the station twice. She had dinner with her neighbor Patrice on Thursday, and they played cards until 10, which was late for both of them, and Evelyn won 3 of 5 games and felt no guilt about it whatsoever. On the 11th day, Reese called again. The council met, he said. All right, she said. She was making coffee. She tucked the phone between her ear and shoulder the way she'd done for 40 years, even though she knew it wasn't good for her neck. I told them everything. All right. There were 240 people in that room, Evelyn. His voice had changed, not the businesslike phone voice from before. Something raw. 240 people, and when I finished talking, you could have heard a pin drop on concrete from 50 feet away. She poured her coffee. Then Hector, he's been in the club 40 years. He's seen everything. He doesn't cry at anything. He said, I need a minute. A pause. And he walked out. And he was out there for about 5 minutes. And when he came back in, he said, what are we going to do about this? Do about what? About you, Reese said. About the station. About the fact that you've been driving out there alone for 3 years, keeping that place alive, because it's the place you feel closest to your husband. His voice was careful now, the way you're careful when you're about to say something that might come out wrong. The council wants to do something. Not because they owe you, because they want to. Because Hector said, he stopped, cleared his throat. He said, we spend a lot of time talking about loyalty and about what it means to stand for something. And here's a woman in her 70s standing alone in a parking lot in 95-degree heat with a bolt cutter, and she already knows everything we're supposed to know. What does it say about us if we just go home? Evelyn set down her coffee mug. She stood very still. What does the council want to do? She asked. That depends on what you'll let us do, Reese said. But we'd like to start with the station, if you're willing. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the morning light was doing what it does in Montana, coming in at an angle that makes everything look like it was placed there on purpose, like someone spent a long time deciding exactly where to put each thing. Harold had loved this light. He used to stand on the porch with his coffee and just look at it. She picked the mug back up. Tell me what you're thinking, she said, and Reese told her. By the time he finished, her coffee was cold, and she was sitting at the kitchen table instead of standing at the counter, and she had Harold's notepad in front of her with 3 pages of notes in her own handwriting, because her memory wasn't what it used to be, and she needed to write things down now when they mattered. That's more than I expected, she said. I know. I need to think about it. I figured you would. A pause. Bear said to tell you that thinking about it is fine, but not calling is not. She laughed before she could decide not to. Tell him I heard him, she said. She spent 2 days thinking about it. She drove out to the station on the first day and walked the whole property again slowly, seeing it the way you see something when you're trying to see it clearly instead of the way you've gotten used to seeing it. She stood at the back fence again. She looked at the rust marks. Then she looked at the sign above the door, Harold's name in faded red on white, Carter's Service, Est in 1979. She drove home. She sat in Harold's chair. She thought about what he would say. She already knew what he would say. He'd been saying it for 44 years. Different words every time. Same sentence underneath. If someone needs something and you can give it, give it. Don't make them ask twice. On the second day, she called Reese. Yes, she said, but I want to be there for all of it. I'm not going to let you do things to my husband's property without me there to see it done right. Wouldn't have it any other way, Reese said. Can we start Saturday? I'll have coffee ready, she said. I know you will. Another pause. Evelyn, how many people are you planning for? She stopped. She realized she hadn't asked how many were coming. She realized now that she thought about it that Reese had been very specific about some things in their conversation and very vague about others, and the number of people was one of the things he'd been vague about. How many should I plan for? She asked. A brief silence. Maybe plan for a lot, Reese said carefully. She almost asked what a lot meant. She didn't. She said okay and hung up and went to write a grocery list on Harold's notepad. Underneath the council notes, underneath Harold's old grocery list with their faded pencil and their handwriting, she'd memorized so thoroughly she could reproduce it if she tried. She didn't know. She had no framework for what Saturday was going to look like. She made a lot of coffee, and she waited, and she thought about what Bear had said in the parking lot, about showing up, about doing the work, about the only way to change a story being to keep going out there and writing over it. She thought Harold, you would not believe this week. She thought you probably would, actually. She thought you always believed in people harder than the evidence warranted, and you were usually right. Saturday came in cool and bright, the way late summer mornings come in Montana, before the heat arrives, before the day becomes what it's going to be. She drove out early, she made the coffee, she unlocked the storage room and propped the door, which swung open beautifully now, perfectly like it was, apologizing for years of bad behavior, and she stood in the lot watching the highway. She heard them before she saw them. A sound like weather, like something building at a distance. A low, continuous rumble that grew and grew until it stopped being background and became foreground, until it was not a sound in the periphery, but a sound that was all there was. And then they appeared at the bend in the highway. She stood very still. She counted to 10. She was still counting. She stopped counting because the counting was not going to resolve. 2,000 motorcycles. Not 100, not 200. 2,000 from every direction, every charter, every state within range of a phone call that had been made 10 days ago in a truck pulling away from her lot. A call that had become a council meeting, that had become a story told in a room of 240 people, a story that had spread the way. Real things spread not because someone pushed it, but because it pulled people in on its own weight. They were coming down her husband's highway. They were coming to her husband's station. Evelyn Carter stood in the parking lot with her hand over her mouth and tears running down her face, and she thought, Harold, are you seeing this? And the first riders pulled in, and Bear got off his bike and walked toward her. And he looked at her face, at the tears, at the hand over her mouth, and he didn't say anything for a moment. He just stood there. Then he said very quietly, very simply, in the voice of a man who has finally found the right word, after a very long search, we came. 2,000 motorcycles take a long time to park. Evelyn stood with Bear and watched it happen. The organized, unhurried choreography of it, riders directing riders, sections filling, and then the next section opening all of it, moving with the kind of practiced efficiency that comes from people who have done large gatherings enough times that the logistics are in their muscle memory. She'd been to county fairs smaller than this. She'd been to Harold's funeral, where 200 people showed up, and she'd thought that was the most people she'd ever seen gather for one reason. She revised that number standing in the lot with her hands still not quite steady, and the sound of 2,000 engines going quiet one by one, like a vast orchestra finishing a chord. Bear stayed beside her. He didn't explain. He didn't narrate. He just stayed there, which was exactly right, and she was grateful for it in the specific way you're grateful when someone understands without being told what you need. Are you all right? He finally asked. I'm trying to figure that out, she said honestly. He nodded. He understood the honest answer. Reese appeared from the far end of the lot, navigating through the crowd with the efficiency of a man who knows exactly where he's going at all times. He had two men with him she hadn't seen before, one of them older than Bear, heavyset with a white beard and the patient eyes of someone who'd been around long enough to stop being surprised by most things. The other one was younger, maybe 40, and carried himself with the specific uprightness of someone who'd spent time in the military and never entirely left it behind. Evelyn, Reese said, I want you to meet Hector. He nodded toward the white-bearded man. He's been with the club 40 years. And this is Marcus Webb, different Marcus than you've met. We've got a few. He coordinates our volunteer operations. He's the one who made the calls. Hector extended his hand. She took it. His grip was the careful grip of a large man who has learned to moderate his strength around people who might not expect it. I've heard about you, he said. His voice was the kind that had been lived in for a long time, rough at the edges, but with something underneath it that was almost formal, like a man who'd taught himself how to speak carefully in rooms where it mattered. Bear told the story in that council meeting. I've heard a lot of stories in 40 years. Yours was different. Different how? She asked. I thought about it. He was the kind of man she could see who thought before he spoke. Most stories are about what people do under pressure. This one was about what you didn't do. You didn't run. You didn't freeze. You didn't weigh it up and decide it wasn't your problem. He shook his head slowly. In my experience, not doing something is usually the harder thing. Harold used to say that, Evelyn said, that the not doing is usually where people get tripped up. Hector looked at her for a moment. Your husband sounds like he was a man worth knowing. The best one I ever knew. Then it makes sense, Hector said. You don't get to 44 years with the best person you ever knew without it changing how you see the world. She hadn't thought about it that way. She stood with that for a moment and filed it away in the place where she kept things worth coming back to. Marcus Webb, the coordinator, was already moving. He had a clipboard. She noticed this, the clipboard, the precision of it, and he was talking to a group of 12 men who were nodding with the purposeful nods of people being briefed on a task they were ready to execute. Beyond them, people were unloading from trucks that had pulled in behind the motorcycles' trucks. She hadn't fully registered in the sheer visual volume of the bikes themselves. Lumber, contrary mix, power tools in their cases, the good kind, paint in buckets, more paint. Roofing materials that went beyond what the crew had done a week ago. She looked at Bear. I told you we'd be back, he said. You told me Reese offered. You didn't say. She gestured at the entirety of what was happening. I may have left out some of the scale. You definitely left out some of the scale. He almost smiled. I wasn't sure you'd say yes if you knew. She looked at him. You were right, she admitted. I might not have. I know, that's why. He paused. But you also said Harold would have invited people in and kept them there for hours. And I figured if you couldn't say yes to it beforehand, you'd at least say yes to it once it was happening. She thought about that, about the particular manipulation of it, the kind that's done with care, the kind that isn't manipulation, really. Just an understanding of how someone needs to be moved toward the thing that's good for them when their own hesitation is in the way. Harold had done it to her exactly once. In 1981, when she'd been afraid to have a second child after a difficult first pregnancy, and he'd arranged for them to stay a week with his sister, who had 3 kids, in a house full of noise and life, and by the 3rd day she'd stopped being afraid. He'd never mentioned what he'd done. She'd figured it out years later and confronted him, and he'd said completely unapologetically, I knew you'd get there. I just moved you a little closer. She looked at Bear. Harold would have liked you, she said. Bear absorbed that. She watched it land. That might be the nicest thing anyone's said to me in years, he said. Marcus Webb appeared at her elbow. Mrs. Carter, I want to walk you through what we're planning if you have a few minutes. Get your approval before we start anything structural. I have all the time you need, she said. He walked her through it with the systematic clarity of someone who respects the person he's briefing. Not talking down, not glossing over, just thorough. What they wanted to do with the main structure, where they planned to reinforce the foundation, what the plan was for the pump island, what they were thinking for the interior. He asked questions as much as he explained, making sure each element was what she wanted before it became what was happening. At one point, he said, the sign. We'd like to restore it, if that's all right. The original lettering Harold's name. We found a painter in Billings who does restoration work, and he looked at the photographs Bear took last week, and he says he can match the original. Evelyn stopped walking. You took photographs, she said to Bear, who had drifted along with them. Bear had the expression of a man who has been caught in something that isn't wrong exactly, but is more than he'd mentioned. I noticed the sign when I was here for the roof, he said. The original paint is still under the weather damage. He paused. I thought it should look the way it looked when Harold put it up. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about Harold at 31 years old with his arm around her at the opening, grinning like he'd pulled off the greatest heist of his life. She thought about that sign going up and Harold stepping back to look at it and saying, there, now it's real. Yes, she said, yes, I want that. Marcus made a note on his clipboard. They kept walking. The work started with the organized simultaneity of a large crew that has been properly briefed and divided. Roofing team up on the main structure, the better materials they'd brought this time for the sections they hadn't gotten to before. Foundation crew around the back. Interior crew that had gotten her approval to pull the damaged drywall in the storage area and replace it properly. And then a quieter crew, the one she noticed most, that was doing something different, not construction, but cleaning. Going through the interior of the station with the careful attention of people who understand that some things in a space are just old and some things in a space are meant to stay. They figured out the difference. She didn't have to tell them. Harold's old sign stayed. His hand-lettered price boards from 1982 that said things like, check your oil. It costs less than an engine and Harold's coffee made right no exceptions. The photograph on the wall stayed. His tools in the labeled green box, nobody touched those. The chair stayed. One of the younger men, she'd later learn his name was Pete, that he was 26 and had grown up in Billings and had actually driven past Carter's service 100 times as a kid without thinking about it, came to find her mid-morning with something in his hand. "Mrs. Carter, we found this behind the old register." It was a coffee mug, ceramic white with the name of a tire brand on it that had gone out of business in the 90s. She knew this mug. Harold drank from it every morning for 15 years, and then it disappeared one day, and he'd been quietly bereft about it for a week in the Harold way, not complaining, just slightly less himself until he got a new one that became the new favorite. She had not known it was behind the register. She had not known it was still in this building. She held it for a long moment. Pete watched her with the slightly alarmed expression of a 26-year-old who is afraid he's upset someone. "Are you swam?" "I'm fine," she said. "This is fine, thank you." She turned the mug in her hands. "He looked for this. He never found it." "I'm sorry," Pete said, and he meant it the way young people mean it, when they're sorry about something that happened before they were old enough for it to be their fault, just genuinely sorry that sorrow exists. "Don't be," she said. "Finding things is better than not finding them, even when it hurts a little." She looked at him. "Do you know that—" He thought about it. "I'm starting to," he said. She put the mug on the counter next to Harold's photograph and left it there where it could be seen. By mid-morning, the lot had taken on the quality of something between a work site and a reunion. The loud, focused energy of large-scale labor mixed with the undercurrent of people who know each other and are glad to be in the same place. She moved through it, and people made way for her with a naturalness that wasn't deference, exactly more like recognition. The way a crowd orients around someone who belongs to the center of something. Hector found her near the pump island watching the concrete crew work. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "I've been getting that question a lot lately," she said. "The answer keeps being yes." He almost smiled. "When Bear told the story at the council meeting, he got to the part where you came back around the corner with the bolt cutters. And a man named Garrett, he's been with us 30 years. He's not a man who shows much." Garrett said out loud in a room full of people. He said, "I'm not going to pretend I'm not ashamed right now." He paused. He meant ashamed that it was you and not someone else. Someone closer. Someone who should have been looking. She was quiet. "People drive that highway," Hector continued. "Trucks, cars. It's not a road without traffic, and 4 men were chained to that fence for 16 hours and nobody stopped." He stopped. "Nobody but you." "I almost didn't stop," she said. "I've thought about that. My hand was on the car door." "But you didn't." "No." "What stopped you?" She considered it the way she'd been considering it since the day it happened. Coming at it from different angles, the way you do with something you can't quite see the whole shape of yet. "I think," she said slowly, "that it was Harold, actually. Not a vision or anything like that. I'm a practical woman. But when I heard that sound and I stood in the doorway and I thought about getting back in the car, I thought about what I would, if he were still here, what I would say when I came home that night." She paused, and I couldn't make the sentence. I couldn't construct the version of that conversation where I told Harold I heard a person in trouble and I kept walking and it came out in a way I could live with. Hector was quiet for a long time. 40 years, he finally said. 40 years in this club. I've heard a lot of reasons people did the right thing. That's the most honest one I've ever heard." She laughed a small, surprised laugh. "It's not very heroic." "That's exactly why it is," he said. Noon came and someone, she never did figure out who had organized it, had set up food. Not sandwich, not something casual. Actual food, the real kind. Coolers full of it. Someone clearly had planned this as a meal that would feed 2,000 people and had done the math properly. She tried to help organize it and was gently, firmly redirected by 3 different people who clearly had it handled and were also clearly going to make sure she sat down. She sat next to Bear at one of the folding tables that had appeared from somewhere. Danny sat across from her. Tomas was down the table, already deep in a conversation with 2 men she didn't know. Marcus, the one from the fence, sat at the end, quieter than the others, eating with the concentrated focus of someone who has remembered that they were hungry and is addressing it seriously. "How's the finger?" she asked Bear. He held up his right hand. The tape job was gone, replaced with something more professional, but the discoloration was still visible. "Set wrong," he said. "Had to have it reset." The doctor asked how I'd been managing it, and I said a 76-year-old woman had taped it up, and he said that explained why it needed resetting. I told you I wasn't perfect. You told me you weren't perfect that one time. You've been pretty close to perfect every other time. She gave him a look. He received it without apparent discomfort. I'm not flattering you, he said. I'm stating a fact. There's a difference. Harold used to make that same argument. Harold sounds like he was usually right. He was. It was occasionally irritating. Bear laughed. It was a full laugh this time. All the way through, she'd been hearing it edge toward that since the first day, and now it arrived complete. She understood watching it why people followed this man. Not just because he was lost or because he'd been doing this 30 years. Because he was underneath everything he'd accumulated, a person who was genuinely present in whatever room he was in. He didn't perform, he just was. Danny had been watching her with an expression that meant he had something to say and was working up to it. Go ahead, she told him. He blinked. Whatever you're working up to, go ahead. He looked at Bear, who said nothing, which Danny had apparently learned meant you're on your own with this one. I've been thinking about what you said, Danny said. When I asked you why you didn't drive away, you said once you knew it was a person, you couldn't unknow it. Yes. I've been trying to figure out if that's a thing you learn or a thing you're born with. She considered it. What do you think? I think it's a thing you learn, but I think you have to learn it from someone. He was quiet for a moment. My grandmother, the one I told you about. I was 14 when she died, and I've been thinking if she'd lived longer, if I'd had more time with her. He stopped. I think I turned out okay, but I think I would have turned out better. The table had gotten quieter. Not everyone was listening, but enough were. You turned out fine, Evelyn said. You don't know that. I know what I see, she said simply. And what I see is a 28-year-old man who is thinking about his grandmother and what she would have taught him. That's not a person who turned out badly. He was quiet. She'd be proud of you, Evelyn said. That's not something I can know for certain, but it's something I believe. Danny looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up. Can I ask you something that's going to sound weird? Of course. Would you, Tora? He stopped. Try it again. Would you be all right with us coming back here, not just today, like regularly? She looked at him. The thing Hector wants to talk to you about, he said, the idea he has for what this place could be. I wanted to ask you separately because I didn't want it to get lost in the big conversation. He paused. I wanted you to know that it's not just a project. For me, it's not. I want to come back here because, he stopped again, looked at his hands, because being here feels like something I didn't know I was missing. She thought about Harold's empty chair. She thought about 3 years of driving out alone to sit with what wasn't there anymore. Yes, she said, you can come back. He exhaled. She hadn't realized until then how much he'd been holding. After lunch, Hector found her. I want to tell you what I'm thinking, he said, and I want you to stop me if any of it's wrong. All right, this property, the location, the building, the highway access, I think it could be something beyond what it is. Not a commercial operation, something different. He paused, choosing his words. There are people on that highway every day who are in trouble. Broke down, broke in every sense of the word. Veterans on the road with nowhere clear to go. Families driving cross-country on the edge. Truck drivers who've been on the road too long and need somewhere real to stop that isn't a parking lot. He looked at the building. I'm thinking a way station. Free coffee, free basic car, help a place to sit and make a call. Staffed by volunteers. Us and whoever else wants to be part of it. Running on donations from the club and from other people who want to help. He looked at her. Harold's name on the sign. Harold's station. But doing something Harold probably would have approved of. She was quiet for a long time. He would have approved, she said. He'd have said it was obvious and he did know why nobody had done it already. Hector made a sound that was almost a laugh. That's a good sign. Means it's the right idea. Who runs it? Volunteers rotated. We'll put together a schedule. Members from the Billings Charter primarily since they're closest, but we'll pull from Missoula and Great Falls too. And he paused. We'd want your involvement, not running it yourself, not at 76 in Montana winters alone, but your name on it, your history behind it, your voice on what it should be. He looked at her directly. Harold built this. It should have a Carter at the center of it. She thought about 3 grandchildren. She thought about calling them more. She thought about Denver, Phoenix, Portland, and the vast geographic inconvenience of modern families. She thought about what Bear had said: the only way to change a story is to write over it. Keep going out, keep doing the work, give people something else to look at. There's one condition, she said. Hector waited. The chair in the office, Harold's chair, it stays exactly where it is. Nobody moves it, nobody replaces it. If the office needs work around it, they work around it. She paused. When people come in and sit in that office, I want them to see that chair and know that everything in this place came from something a person built with his hands because he loved his work and his family. She looked at Hector. The chair is Harold. The chair stays. Hector nodded once slowly with the gravity of a man making a real commitment. The chair stays, he said. They shook hands on it. Firm, clean, the handshake of people who don't need a contract because the word is enough. The afternoon moved. The work moved with it. She walked the property again around 3 o'clock, and what she saw made her stop every few feet because what she saw kept requiring a moment. The main roof was done, not patched done. The siding had been stripped and replaced on the east wall where it had been deteriorating for 2 years. Inside, the storage room had been rebuilt from the drywall out clean and solid and properly lit. The pump island was whole, the concrete was whole, and at the front on scaffolding that had gone up so fast she hadn't noticed it happening. 3 men she hadn't met were working on the sign. She couldn't see the sign's face from the scaffolding's angle, but she could see the painter's arm moving. Deliberate practice strokes. The way you move when you know what you're doing and you're doing it well. Bear appeared beside her. How long on the sign, she asked. He said an hour from now, maybe a little less. He paused. He drove in from Billings this morning, left at 5 a.m. He said when Marcus called him and told him what the sign was and who the station belonged to and why they were restoring it, he said he'd have driven from further. He was quiet. He's doing it for free. We offered to pay. He said no. She looked at Bear. People keep doing things for free, she said. I know. Why? I thought about it seriously because she'd asked seriously. Because most people, he said slowly, are just waiting for a reason to be better than they usually manage to be. They want to be the person who shows up. They just need something to show up for. He looked at the sign. You gave them something. I cut 4 locks off a fence, she said. That's all I did. You did it without asking who we were, Bear said. You did it without wanting anything back. You did it because it was a person who needed help, and that was enough reason. He turned to look at her. Do you know how rare that is? Do you actually know how rare that is? She didn't answer. She looked at the painter's arm moving on the sign. My father, Bear said. He wasn't a good man. Not to us, not to my mother, not to much of anybody. And when I was young and I had figured out I was going to be large and I was going to be frightening to some people, I made a choice that I was going to decide what I used that for. I wasn't going to be what he was. I was going to be something else. He paused. But I've spent 30 years running up against the fact that people decide who you are before you get to tell them. And after a while, that takes something from you. Not everything, but something. He stopped. And then you come around a corner and there's a 76-year-old woman who didn't decide who we were. She just saw people who needed help. He was quiet for a moment. That gives something back. Do you understand? That gives back what the other thing took. She looked at him for a long moment. I understand, she said. She meant it. The painter came down from the scaffolding at 4:15. He was a small man, wiry with paint on his hands that he'd been wiping at with a cloth for the last 10 minutes. He found her in the lot and said, Mrs. Carter, if you want to look. She walked to the front of the building and looked up. Carter's service, Estewis, 1979. The red on white exact, she would have staked her life on it, being exact, the same proportions, the same letter forms, the same deliberate amateur formality of a man who had not been a sign painter, but had done his research and taken his time. Under the name in smaller letters that had been obscured by years of weather now visible again, Harold and Evelyn Carter Proprietors. She had forgotten about that. She had forgotten that her name was on it too. She stood looking at her own name on the sign Harold had put up in 1979, and she felt the years do something strange, compress and expand simultaneously, The way time moves when you encounter something from the far end of your own life and find it still perfectly intact. Mamre the painter, uncertain. Is it right we can adjust any? It's exactly right, she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. Around her, without any signal we could identify the work, sounds had slowed and stopped. 2,000 people in a parking lot, and somehow without anyone calling for it, a quiet had fallen. The kind of quiet that happens when everyone present understands at the same moment that something is worth being quiet for. She became aware that she was standing in the center of it. She became aware of what these 2,000 people had done today, what they'd left and driven to get here, what they'd brought with them and put up and built and fixed and painted and cleaned. Not for money, not for recognition, not for any reason that she could call transactional. She turned to face them. She didn't have a speech. She'd never been a person who had speeches. Harold was the one who could stand up and talk. She was the one who listened and nodded, and occasionally, when he went too long, gave him the look that meant wrap it up, love. She said, Harold would have shaken every one of your hands and remembered every one of your names and found some reason to laugh with each of you before the day was out. She stopped. I can't promise all of that, but I can promise the handshakes if you'll let me. She held out her hand. Bear was closest. He took it. He held it for a moment and looked at her, and she looked back, and in that look was everything that didn't need saying. Then Hector, then Danny, who gripped her hand and then pulled her into a brief hug that was clearly not planned and was clearly beyond what he'd expected himself to do, and she accepted it without hesitation. Then Tomas, then Marcus, the original Marcus, who shook her hand with a formality that was itself a kind of tenderness. Then Reese, then the painter, then men she didn't know and would probably never learn the names of one after another. The line of it, long and unhurried in the afternoon light of a Montana August. She shook every hand. It took 45 minutes. And when she finally put her hand down and looked around at what Harold's station had become, what it was going to be, she felt with a clarity she hadn't felt in 3 years. What Harold had meant when he said, this is real. She felt it now. It was real. The station opened on a Tuesday. Not a Saturday, not a weekend, not a day chosen for symbolism or convenience. A Tuesday because Marcus Webb had looked at the volunteer schedule and the supply situation and the readiness of everything that needed to be ready and said, Tuesday is when it's ready, so Tuesday is when it opens. And that was that. Evelyn had appreciated the absence of ceremony in that decision. Harold had been the same way when something was done you started. You didn't wait for a better day. She drove out at 7 in the morning. The sign was there above the door in the early light, exactly as it had been since the painter finished it, and she still hadn't gotten used to seeing it. She probably never would. Some things you don't get used to. You just keep being surprised by them, which is its own kind of gift. Reese was already there. So was a man named Gil 50s Broad with a mechanical background that Marcus had described as extensive in a way that meant he could fix almost anything with wheels and had done so for 30 years. Gil was the one who would handle roadside assists, who would go out when someone called in from the highway needing help that couldn't wait. Mrs. Carter the Gil said the first time he met her, he had the directness of people who work with their hands. No warm-up, no social preamble. I want you to know I'm not going to let anything happen to what you've built here. What Harold built, she said. What you're both building, he said without missing a beat. Harold built the first one. You're building the second. She liked him immediately. The first morning was quiet. 3 vehicles pulled in a family in a minivan who needed to use the restroom and ended up staying 40 minutes because their youngest daughter discovered Harold's old hand-lettered signs and wanted to read all of them, asking her parents what this one meant and that one meant. A trucker who came in for coffee and left without saying mom, but came back an hour later with a $20 bill he folded and pushed across the counter and said, for whoever needs it. Before he left again, and a man in his 60s driving a car with one tire noticeably lower than the others who hadn't noticed, and Gil spotted it from the lot and walked out and told him. And the man stood there watching Jill change his tire with the expression of someone who has been alone with a problem for so long he's forgotten other people exist. That was the first morning. The second morning, 6 vehicles. The third, 9. By the end of the first week, the word was out in the way word gets out on long highway roads, the trucker network, which Evelyn had not fully understood was a real and functioning thing, until it proved itself had spread the information with the efficiency of people who spend their lives dependent on knowing where the good stops are. She was there 4 days a week, not running things. She'd been clear about that, and Reese and Marcus had been clear about honoring it, but present. In Harold's chair in the office, available the way a person is available when they're somewhere they belong. People came in, they drank coffee. Some of them talked to her and some of them didn't, and she was good with both. It was a veteran who changed things. His name was Ray. He came in on a Wednesday afternoon in the station's third week driving a truck that was 15 years old and held together with what Gil would later describe as optimism and rust. He was 57, ex-Army, 2 tours in the early 2000s. He didn't volunteer any of this immediately. He came in, poured himself coffee from the pot on the counter. Everyone poured their own that had been established early and sat at the small table near the window and didn't say anything. Evelyn was in Harold's chair. She looked at him once and then went back to what she was doing, which was writing letters, actual letters, by hand to her 3 grandchildren, because she'd decided some time ago that email was fine for quick things, but a handwritten letter was a different kind of message. One that said, "I thought about you for longer than it takes to type." After 20 minutes, Ray said, "You're the woman." She looked up. "I'm a woman," she said. "Probably the one you mean. The one who cut those guys loose." "That was me." He looked at his coffee. "I heard about it from a guy at a stop in Billings." "He heard it from somebody else." He paused. "The way he told it, you were about 90 and there were chains involved and you got them out with garden shears." 76, Evelyn said. "Bolt cutters. The rest is mostly right." Ray almost smiled. "Why'd you do it?" She was starting to recognize this question as the central question, the one everyone eventually arrived at. She'd gotten better at answering it, not because the answer had changed, but because she'd found the shortest path to its core. Because they were people who needed help, she said. That was enough reason. I was quiet again. Long enough that she went back to her letter. She was writing to her granddaughter in Portland, who was 17 and going through something difficult that she'd told her grandmother about in a late-night phone call that Evelyn had been thinking about since. "I've been on the road 6 weeks, Ray said. She put her pen down. "My wife and I split up in May. Sold the house. I had a plan." He paused. "The plan didn't survive contact with reality, which is something they told us in the Army, but I thought I'd gotten better at avoiding." He looked at the window. "I've got a sister in Spokane. I've been meaning to get to Spokane for 6 weeks and I can't seem to make myself go the last 300 miles. Why not?" I thought about it. "Because once I get there, I have to figure out what comes next. And right now I'm still in the part where I'm moving and that feels like doing something." He paused. "Does that make sense?" "It makes a lot of sense," she said. She set down her letter and thought for a moment about what Harold would do. Harold would ask the right question. Harold always found the right question, the one that wasn't the obvious one, the one that opened something instead of closing it. "What does your sister think you need?" she asked. Ray looked at her, surprised. "I don't know," he said. "She keeps calling. I keep saying I'm almost there." "Have you asked her what she thinks you need?" "That's not really how He stopped. "No, I haven't asked." "Men don't usually," Evelyn said without judgment. Harold didn't either. It took him 11 years to understand that asking someone what they think you need isn't weakness. It's information, and you can't navigate without information. Ray turned his coffee cup in his hands. He sounds like he knew what he was talking about. "Eventually," she said. "He got there eventually." She reached under the counter. There was a small charging station Marcus had set up. Practical man, and she pushed Ray's phone back toward him where he'd left it. "Call your sister," she said. "Not to say you're almost there. Call her and ask her what she thinks you need, and then listen to the answer." He looked at the phone. He looked at her. "You're not what I expected from a gas station," he said. "Harold would have said the coffee explains it," she said. He was probably right. Ray called his sister. He sat at the small table and he talked for 40 minutes, and Evelyn could hear the shape of the conversation without hearing the words, the long silences where Ray was listening, the shorter patches where he was talking, the one moment where his voice changed in a way that meant something had gotten through. When he hung up, he sat for a moment with his hands flat on the table. "She said I need to stop moving," he said. "She said I've been moving my whole life, Army then, work then, moving for work, and I need to stop and let something be still for a while." He paused. "She said she has a room and a job lead and that I'm allowed to not have a plan yet." "That's a good sister," Evelyn said. "Yeah." He stood up. He was a big man. She hadn't fully registered it when he was sitting. Big in the way of men who've done physical work for a long time, and it's become just how they are. He picked up his coffee cup and rinsed it at the small sink, which nobody had asked him to do, and set it in the drying rack. "Thank you," he said. "The coffee's free," she said, "always." "Not for the coffee." He paused at the door. For whatever that was. After he left, she sat for a while in Harold's chair thinking about 6 weeks on the road and a sister in Spokane, and a plan that hadn't survived contact with reality. She thought about the way he'd rinsed his own cup without being asked, and thought, there it is. There's the person underneath. Jill came in around 5 and she told him about Ray, not all of it, but the shape of it, and Jill listened with the focused attention he gave to everything. "Third one this week," Jill said. "Third veteran, I mean. Who came through?" She looked at him. "Monday there was a woman, Marine's early 40s. Her truck needed work and we fixed it, but she stayed 2 hours. She and Danny talked. Danny's got a cousin who served. They had that language in common." Gil paused. "Yesterday, a man who'd been sleeping in his car. He didn't say he'd served, but he had the tattoos and the way he held himself. Bear drove out, and they sat outside for an hour, and I don't know what they talked about, but when the man left, he drove straight, and he was looking at the road properly, before he was drifting." She absorbed that. "We need to tell Hector," she said. "I already did. He's been thinking about it." Jill hesitated. "He wants to talk to you about making it official, outreach, connecting with the VA with veterans organizations, having people here who have the right training for when someone comes in and needs more than coffee and a conversation." "He's right," Evelyn said. "Harold would say the same. You don't do something halfway when people are counting on it." Gil nodded. He had the look of someone who'd been hoping she'd say that and wasn't quite surprised that she had. What nobody had anticipated, not Hector, not Reese, not Marcus with his clipboard, was the news story. A journalist from the Billings paper had been at a diner the day the 2,000 bikes came through. She'd seen the procession. She'd been curious. She'd followed it out to the station and stood at the edge of the lot for 3 hours watching and taking photographs and talking to people at the margins who were willing to talk. She'd filed a story the following week. Local paper modest placement. A television station in Billings picked it up, then one in Missoula. Then a station in Seattle ran a 2-minute segment. Evelyn found out about all of this from her granddaughter in Portland, who called on a Thursday night in the station's 4th week and said, "Grandma, you're on the internet." "I'm aware the internet exists," Evelyn said. "No, I mean you're on it. You're a story. People are sharing it. There's a video of the bikes coming in, and it has like 400,000 views." Evelyn sat down. 400,000, she said. "And that's just one video. There are like 6 others." Her granddaughter's voice had gone from alarmed to excited in the way of 17-year-olds for whom the internet was a native country, and 400,000 views was a real and comprehensible number. "Grandma, do you know there's a whole comment section? There are people crying. There are people from Texas and Ohio and Florida saying they're going to drive to Montana to see the station." She stopped. "That's more than we planned for. Is that okay? Are you okay?" "I'm fine," she said. She stopped again. "Let me think about it." She thought about it. She called Hector. Hector had already heard. He had in fact already had 3 calls from journalists that day and had declined all of them. He said, "The question is what we want this to be, because right now we can still choose." "What do you mean?" "I mean, if we engage with this, if we talk to press, if we let cameras in, it becomes a different thing. It might become a better thing. More reach, more people help, more resources." He paused. "Or it becomes a story that people consume and move on from, and we spend 6 months managing the noise and then it goes quiet, and we're left with a thing that got famous too fast and forgot what it was." He was quiet. "I've seen both happen. I've seen a good thing get loved to death." She thought about that. She thought about Harold's approach to the station, that it was a service, not a performance. That you kept the coffee right and the work right, and you didn't spend energy on what people thought of you because you didn't have energy to spare. "One story," she said. "We give one interview. We choose who we talk to, we control what we say, and then we go back to work. If people come because of it, good. If they don't, also good." Hector was quiet for a moment. The journalist from the Billings paper. She was respectful. She checked facts before she published. She didn't sensationalize. Evelyn said. I'll set it up. The journalist's name was Carol Marsh. She was 34, careful, and when she came to the station, she spent the first 20 minutes just walking around and observing before she asked a single question, which Evelyn took as a good sign. She interviewed Evelyn in Harold's office. She interviewed Bear and Hector and Danny. She photographed the sign in the chair and the hand-lettered signs on the walls. She asked Evelyn, "What do you want people to understand about this place?" Evelyn thought about it the way she thought about everything, not rushing the answer, finding the right one. "I want them to understand it's not about us," she said. "It's not about the club. It's not about me. It's about a stretch of highway where people sometimes need something, and now there's a place that has something to give." She paused. Harold built this station because he believed that a business should serve the people who use it, not the other way around. That's still what it is. It's just serving different people now in a different way. Carol wrote that down. She read it back to make sure she had it right. She asked, "Are you surprised by what happened?" The response, the scale of it. "Every day," Evelyn said. "Every single day I'm surprised." She paused. "But Harold used to say that if you do the right thing cleanly enough, it tends to spread." He meant it as practical advice, not a moral statement. He was a practical man. She looked at the photograph on the wall. "I think about that a lot. Whether what happened here was unusual, or whether it's just what happens when you do a right thing cleanly enough and give it room." The story ran the following Sunday. It was long, full page in the paper with photographs. The headline was simple: Carter's Station, a place to stop on the long road. The response was not simple. By Tuesday, they had received 43 phone calls, 19 emails through the club's contact address, 8 in-person visitors who came specifically because of the article. And this was the one that stopped Evelyn completely. A handwritten letter from a woman in Butte whose husband had stopped at the station 3 weeks earlier when his truck needed coolant, and Gil had helped him, and he'd come home and told her about it, and she'd sat at her kitchen table and cried and hadn't known why exactly until she read the article, and then she'd understood, and she'd written to say thank you in the way you write when words feel insufficient, but you write anyway because the alternative is silence, and silence doesn't honor what you're trying to honor. Evelyn read that letter 4 times. Then she wrote back, a real letter by hand, the same way she wrote to her grandchildren. She told Bear about it that week. He was at the station on Thursday. He came most Thursdays. Now she'd noticed the pattern, and so had he, and neither of them had commented on it, which suited them both. "A letter," he said. "She wrote you a letter." "In cursive," Evelyn said. "Beautiful cursive. Nobody writes cursive anymore." "You do." "I'm 76. I have an excuse." She poured his coffee without asking, which had become the established arrangement. "I wrote back." He looked at her. "Of course you did," he said. "She'll get it Friday probably. I mailed it yesterday." Bear held his coffee and thought about a woman in Butte who had cried at her kitchen table and didn't know why until she did. He thought about a letter written in beautiful cursive and a response written in the same way, 2 women who had never met connected through a stretch of highway, and a man who'd needed coolant and a former serviceman who'd helped without being asked. "Evelyn," he said, "yes. Do you understand what you did? Not the bolt cutters, not the station. The thing underneath all of it." He paused. "You made people believe that things like this are still possible. Real people, not a story, not something on TV, a real thing that happened and keeps happening." He looked at her. "Do you understand what that's worth?" She looked at Harold's photograph. He would have said, "I'm embarrassing him." He would have been proud. Yes, she said it simply. He would have been. The Thursday conversations that had become their own thing. She recognized this without naming it, the way some things are better left without a label. Bear would come in, pour his coffee, sit across from her at the small table, or sometimes in the chair beside Harold's desk, and they would talk. About the station, about what was happening there, about the veterans who came through and the families and the truckers, but also about other things. About his property near Glacier and the years he'd spent carrying the fear of losing it. About her years building something with Harold and the particular silence that had replaced it. One Thursday, he came in and he was quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet. She recognized the difference immediately. She'd lived 44 years with a man who had different kinds of quiet and learned to read them all. "What happened?" she asked. He looked at his coffee. "The men who chained us up," he paused. "There's been some movement on that, on the club's end. The situation is being addressed." She didn't ask what that meant. She'd understood from the beginning that there were dimensions to what he was involved in, that she would not be fully let into, and she'd made her peace with that the same way she'd made her peace with other things that were true and unchangeable. "Are you all right?" she asked. "I will be." "That's not what I asked." He looked up. She held his gaze. "No," he said, "not entirely, not right now." He paused. One of the men involved was someone I'd known for a long time. Not a close friend, but known. And finding out the full extent of what he was involved in, he stopped. "It changes a picture you thought you had." "Betrayal is different from opposition," she said. "Someone you don't know coming at you, that's something you can understand. Someone you knew deciding to, that's something else." He looked at her for a long moment. "How'd you get so clear on that?" "Harold," she said. He had a business partner in the mid-90s. 15 years of friendship and business. The man took $30,000 over 2 years, and Harold didn't know until the books finally showed it clearly. She paused. He never talked about the money. What he talked about was the 15 years. How you hold something like that alongside 15 years and try to figure out which one is the real thing. "What did he decide?" "He decided that both were real," she said. "The 15 years and the betrayal. That a person could be both things. That it hurt more because of the 15 years, not less." She paused. He said the mistake was thinking that time spent with someone was the same as knowing them. That you can be alongside someone for 15 years and still not see the whole of them. She looked at Bear. "It's not your fault that you didn't see it. It's his fault that he hid it." Bear was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she went back to her letters and gave him the room Harold had always given her when she needed to sit with something. After a while, he said, "You know what I keep thinking about? Tell me. Danny asked you if the kind of person you are is something you learn or something you were born with, and you turned it back on him. But I want to know what you actually think." She set down her pen. "I think you're born with the capacity," she said. "Like you're born with the capacity for language. It's in you. But whether it becomes something you actually do, whether it becomes action instead of just potential, that depends on what you're shown, who's around you, what you see people doing when it costs them something." She paused. "I was shown repeatedly by a man who did things that cost him something without making a production of it. 44 years of watching that. It gets into you." She paused. "The question is, who showed it to you?" Bear thought about it. "My grandfather," he said, "before he passed. Not my father, we've established that. My grandfather." He was quiet. "He was a hard man. Worked construction his whole life. Wasn't soft, but he was fair. And I saw him more than once do things that cost him something without making a production of it." He looked at his hands. "I think I've been trying to be him for 30 years, and sometimes I get it right, and sometimes I don't." "That's all any of us are doing," Evelyn said. He nodded. "The property near Glacier," she said. "The one you got back." "Yeah. What does it feel like now when you go there?" He thought about it. "Like I belong to something that's older than me. Like the land was there before I was born, and it'll be there after I'm gone, and I'm just the part of it that's happening right now." He paused. "Harold feel that way about this place." "Deeply," she said. "He used to say the station wasn't his. He was just its current human." Bear made that sound that was almost a laugh. "Its current human." He was a poet sometimes. He didn't know it. They sat for a while in the comfortable quiet of two people who have run out of things that need saying and found that the silence is fine. Outside, she could hear Jill talking to someone at the pump island, a car that had stopped a problem being solved. The station doing its work in the steady, unheroic way that Harold had always believed was the only real kind. She was thinking about the letter from the woman in Butte. She was thinking about the granddaughter in Portland who was going through something difficult. She was thinking about Ray, who she hoped had made it to Spokane and stopped moving. She was thinking about how a Tuesday in summer had led to a chain on a fence, which had led to a bolt cutter, which had led to a phone call, which had led to a council meeting, which had led to 2,000 motorcycles on a Montana highway, which had led to a station that was alive again, doing something its current humans in place and working. She picked up her pen. She went back to her letter. Bear finished his coffee, rinsed his cup the way Ray had rinsed his cup, and set it in the rack. He stopped it at the door. "Same time next Thursday," he said. "Coffee will be ready," she said. He left. She wrote. Outside the highway moved trucks. Cars, people going somewhere with their particular cargo of hope and trouble, and all the things they hadn't figured out yet. And at the bend where Route 12 straightened toward Billings, the sign above the door of Carter's service caught the afternoon light in the way Harold had planned it to catch the light in 1979, when he'd stood on the ladder himself to put it up red on, white clean, and direct his name and her name both still there, still readable from the road. Carter's service, Est, 1979. And below it, newly added at Evelyn's request, in lettering the painter had matched to Harold's style so carefully that you'd have to look twice to see the difference. All are welcome. Coffee is on. Part 5, the first anniversary, crept up on her. She hadn't been counting toward it deliberately. She wasn't the kind of person who marked time by waiting for it to arrive. But Danny called her on a Wednesday evening in late July and said, "It's almost a year." And she realized she'd been aware of it the whole time without letting herself look at it directly, the way you're aware of something bright in your peripheral vision that you haven't turned to face yet. "I know," she said. "Bear wants to do something," Danny said. "The whole charter, multiple charters actually. People have been asking since March whether there's going to be a gathering." He paused. "I told him I'd call you first, before he called, because I wanted you to hear it from someone who'd tell you straight that you can say no if you want." She sat with that for a moment. She was in Harold's chair, the real one at home, the leather one from his study that she'd moved to the living room after he passed, because the living room was where she spent her evenings, and she wanted his chair there. The station's chair was Harold's work chair. This one was his thinking chair. She made the distinction privately and had never explained it to anyone. "How many are we talking about?" she asked. "More than last time," Danny said carefully. "More than 2,000. Possibly significantly more." A pause. "The article got shared a lot. The TV segment got shared a lot. There are people who've been to the station now who've told other people. And there are people who never came but who've been following it." His voice had the particular texture of someone delivering information. They're not sure how the recipient is going to take. "Evelyn, you became something. The station became something. People who've never been to Montana know what Carter's service is, and they want to be part of the day that started it." She thought about the woman in Butte and her beautiful cursive. She thought about Ray driving towards Spokane. She thought about Harold at 31 years old on a ladder hanging a sign and saying, "There, now it's real." "Tell Bear yes," she said. Danny exhaled. "Yeah, yes, but I have one condition." "Name it." "We use it," she said. "Whatever gathering this is, we use it for something real. Not just a celebration. We announce the Veterans Program properly. Hector's been working on the VA partnership for 2 months and it's ready. We make the announcement there with people present so it lands with weight behind it." She paused. Harold didn't believe in occasions for their own sake. He believed in using the moment you've got. "Done," Danny said. He said it fast, like he'd been hoping she'd say exactly that. "Bear's going to want to call you himself." "I know. Tell him I'll be ready." Bear called 20 minutes later. He didn't lead with the gathering. He said, "How are you?" She'd noticed he always did that, not as preamble, not as courtesy, as an actual question requiring an actual answer. "I've been thinking about the year," she said. "What it added up to." What did it add up to? She thought about how to say it precisely because precision mattered when the thing being described was real. It added up to about 300 veterans who came through the station. It added up to 47 roadside assists that Gills logged, not counting the ones he did informally. It added up to letters. "I've kept every letter, Bear. I have a box. It's almost full." She paused. "It added up to my granddaughter from Portland coming to visit for 2 weeks and spending half her time at the station instead of with me. And me not minding, because I could see what it was doing for her, to see what a place can be when it decides to be something." A pause on his end. "Your granddaughter came, Jess, 17. She helped Jill with 3 roadside assists. She told me afterward that she wanted to be a mechanic." Evelyn paused. "She was pre-law 2 months ago." Bear laughed the full one all the way through. "Harold's station converts people. Apparently." She let the moment settle. Danny said more than 2,000. "Yes." "How many more?" "A beat." "Evelyn, I don't want to give you a number that scares you before it has a chance to be beautiful." Bear. 4,000, he said. "Maybe more. Charters from Wyoming, Idaho, Oregon, Washington, Nevada. A charter from Colorado whose president heard the story from someone at a rally in Denver and called me personally." He paused. And it's not just club members. There are veterans groups who want to ride. There are regular people, not bikers, just people who heard about this place and want to be there for the day. His voice was careful, but underneath it was something that wasn't quite contained. We may be looking at closer to 5,000 or 6,000 people, Evelyn. She was quiet. She looked at Harold's photograph on the living room wall, the one from their anniversary 20 years in both of them, looking at each other like they'd just figured something out. Harold, she said quietly, not to Bear, to the photograph. What? Bear said. Nothing, I was just, she stopped. Yes, all right, let's figure out how to do this right. The 3 weeks between that phone call and the anniversary were the fullest 3 weeks she'd had in years. Not the busyness of obligation, the fullness of something real, being built toward a real moment. Marcus Webb was coordinating with the county about traffic management. Hector was finalizing the VA partnership paperwork. Gil was training 2 additional volunteers for the day itself. Reese was managing communications across multiple charters, a job that from the outside appeared to require a small team, and from the inside appeared to require Reese specifically because Reese had a quality she'd come to recognize as the rarest organizational gift, the ability to make complexity feel calm. She was writing letters. She'd been writing all month to Ray in Spokane, who had written back twice, and whose second letter had said he'd started a job and was doing okay, and that he thought about the station sometimes when things were hard because it reminded him that stopping was allowed, that needing something was allowed, that a stranger giving you a coffee and an hour wasn't a debt but a gift. To the woman in Butte, whose name was Sandra, who had become a real correspondent, someone Evelyn looked forward to hearing from. To her grandchildren, all 3 of them telling them what was coming. Jess wrote back from Portland. She said, Grandma, I want to be there. Can I? Evelyn called her instead of writing back. Of course, she said, Mom and Dad too. She paused. Her daughter-in-law Carol and her son Thomas, good people, busy people, the kind of busy that accumulates children and mortgages and commitments until it becomes a way of life and you forget that you chose it rather than it choosing you. She hadn't seen them since Christmas. Invite them, she said, but make sure they understand it's not going to be quiet. Jeff, Grandma, you have like 5,000 bikers coming. 6,000 now last count. A silence on the other end. Grandma, Jess said, you're the most surprising person I know. Your grandfather was more surprising, she said. You just didn't get enough time with him. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a 17-year-old encountering something too large for a quick response. When Jess spoke again, her voice was different, quieter, older, somehow. Tell me about him that day, when he opened the station. So she did. She stood in her kitchen with the phone tucked against her ear, and she told Jess about Harold at 31 years old, putting up that sign, and the way he looked at it and said, now it's real. She told her about the first week when they'd had 12 customers, and Harold had remembered all 12 names and what they'd each ordered. She told her about the 15 years of mornings when she'd sit in the office and he'd be out in the shop, and she could hear him working, and that sound of a person doing what they were built to do was one of the great sounds of her life. She talked until she realized she'd been talking for 20 minutes, and Jess hadn't said a word. Jess, I'm here, her voice was thick. I'm listening. Don't cry, Evelyn said. He didn't like people crying on his behalf. He said it was a waste of water. Jess made a sound that was half sob, half laugh. That's such a Harold thing to say. It really was. The morning of the anniversary came in the way mornings come in Montana in August, with the sky doing more than a sky strictly needs to do, the light spreading before the sun is visible, the air holding the last of the cool, before the day decides what temperature it wants to be. She was up before 5. She made coffee at home, sat in Harold's thinking chair for an hour, and talked to him the way she talked to him on important mornings. She told him what was happening. Not as if he didn't know she was a practical woman. She'd always been a practical woman. She understood the mechanics of death as well as anyone who'd sat beside it. But talking to Harold had never been about his reception of the words. It had been about the act of forming them, about finding out what she thought by hearing herself say it. She said, I think you'd find this ridiculous in the best way. I think you'd stand at the edge of the lot and count motorcycles and lose count and start over and lose count again and then just stop counting and laugh. She paused. I think you'd spend the whole day learning names. I think by the end of it, you'd have 50 new people you were going to stay in touch with, And you'd actually do it because you always did. She stopped. I miss you every day. I want you to know that I miss you every day and that it doesn't stop me. You didn't raise me to be stopped by grief. You raised me by being someone I couldn't imagine stopping for, and I think that's the best gift you gave me. She looked at his photograph. Okay, I'm going now. She drove out at 6. Bear was already there. She hadn't expected that. He was sitting on the steps outside the station's front door, with his coffee poured from the pot she'd had set on a timer the night before, a detail she'd arranged thinking there would be early arrivals on the crew, not thinking specifically that it would be him first, and he stood when he heard her car. You're early, she said. I didn't sleep much, he said. I drove out. She came up the steps and stood beside him and looked at the highway in the early light. It's going to be a good day, he said. Yes. Are you ready? She considered the question the way it deserved. I've been ready for a year, she said. I've been getting ready since the day I walked around that corner. He nodded. He handed her his coffee mug, the station mug, the one she'd given him the first day, the one he'd adopted. And she took a sip without thinking twice about it, and neither of them remarked on this, which was its own kind of statement. They came at 9. She heard them from inside. She was at the counter, writing something. She was always writing something. The letters had become a constant, a discipline, her way of keeping the web of connections from becoming abstract. And she heard the first distant rumble and looked up and met Gil's eyes across the room, and he said, "Here they come." She went outside. The highway was full, not approaching full, the way a river is full in spring, bank to bank, the volume of it. Something you feel in your chest before you hear it clearly. 6,000, the latest estimate, maybe more. Charters from 9 states. Veterans groups on bikes and trucks, in cars. Regular people, she could distinguish them, the non-riders, the ones who'd driven and parked down the road and walked up. Civilians who had come because the story had gotten into them somehow, and they needed to be somewhere it was real. A church van from Billings whose pastor had heard about the veterans program from one of his congregation. 3 members of the Montana state legislature who'd apparently called Reese and asked if they could come, and Reese had said yes because what else do you say? And in the middle of all of it, her family. Thomas and Carol and Jess standing near the edge of the lot looking slightly overwhelmed, which was the correct response to the situation. She saw them before they saw her, and she watched Jess's face as Jess looked around at the scale of it, at what her grandmother had become connected to, at the sign above the door, at the people at the trucks delivering supplies for the Veterans Program announcement, at all of it, and she watched her granddaughter's face do something she would hold in her memory for the rest of her life. Jess looked at it all, and she understood it. The understanding moved across her face like light across a room when someone opens a curtain, and then Jess turned and found her grandmother and started walking toward her, and Evelyn met her halfway, and Jess held on and said into her shoulder, "Grandma, you did this." "We did this," Evelyn said. "All of us. You started it." "Harold started it in 1979, she said. "I just kept the electricity on." Thomas peered beside them. Her son, 51 years old. Harold's jaw and her eyes, a man she'd watched grow from a boy who couldn't sit still into someone who'd found his stillness somewhere in his 40s. He put his arm around her and didn't say anything for a moment, and she let that be enough. Carol was already talking to Danny, which didn't surprise her at all. Carol had always been able to talk to anyone, which was one of the things Harold had loved about her immediately. "She's good people," he'd said the first time Thomas had brought her home. High praise from Harold. The highest, really. Hector found her at 10 o'clock. He had the VA partnership documents under his arm, finalized, signed, real. He held them up when he saw her, and she felt the weight of what they represented. Not paper, but the thing behind the paper. The commitment, the structure, the formal acknowledgement that this place was going to keep doing what it had been doing, but with more reach, more resources, more ability to be there for the people who came through, who needed more than coffee and a conversation. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she said. "We announce it at noon. We announce it at noon." He put the documents under his arm again and looked at the crowd, at the sea of people that had gathered on a Tuesday in August on a highway in Montana because a 76-year-old woman had heard a sound and not kept driving. "I've been doing this 40 years, he said. "I've never seen anything like this." "Good or bad?" He looked at her. "Good," he said. "Like fundamentally good. Like something you can show someone when they ask you if people are actually capable of this." He paused. "My son is 22. He's going through a time. He doesn't believe in much right now. I want to show him this. He paused again. Would that be all right? Bring him any time, she said. The coffee's always on. Bear made his way to her at 11. He moved through the crowd the way he always moved, not parting it exactly. More like the crowd adjusted to him, the way water adjusts around something solid. He had Thomas with him and Marcus, and behind them, hanging back slightly, with the self-consciousness of the recently recovered Danny. The four of them together. The four who'd been chained to her fence on a summer day a year ago. She looked at all four of them. They looked at her. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Thomas, quiet Thomas, the one who listened more than he talked, who had a daughter in Missoula, who was 12 now and had started Little League again, said, "A year ago today." "A year ago today," she said. Marcus, the original, Marcus, the one with the trapped animal eyes who had told her thank you before the others had words for it, said, "I was in bad shape that day. I don't talk about it much. But I want you to know I was in bad shape and not just physically." He paused, held her gaze. "What I was thinking out there toward the end, the things I was starting to conclude about." He stopped. "And then you came around that corner, and you looked at us like we were just people who needed help. And that was," he stopped again, shook his head. "It changed something, not just in the moment, something that stayed changed." She looked at him carefully. "Are you all right now?" "Not that day. Now." "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I am." He said it with the specific weight of someone who has checked the answer recently and found it true. "I found somebody to talk to. Bear pushed me. It took a while." He glanced at Bear, who received this information with the dignity of someone who has waited a long time for it to be said out loud. "But yeah, I'm all right." "Good," she said. "That matters more than everything else." At noon, Hector stood on the steps of the station. He didn't have a microphone. He'd refused one, said he'd been in rooms full of people making themselves heard before amplification existed. He didn't need to start now. His voice carried. 40 years of making himself heard in loud rooms had given him a voice that needed no assistance. He spoke for 7 minutes. He told the story, the real version, all of it, the chain and the heat and the bolt cutters, and the woman who came around a corner and didn't see what most people saw when they looked at 4 Hells Angels members in leather. He told it plainly without embellishment, which was the right way to tell it because the plain version was already extraordinary. He told it to 6,000 people standing in a Montana parking lot in August, and she could hear, standing near the steps, Harold's mug in her hand, you could hear the quality of the silence that followed the end of the story. The kind of silence that isn't absence of sound, the kind that's presence of something. Then Hector announced the VA partnership. He named what it would do, the counseling resources, the outreach, the formal relationship with the Veteran Services Network, the satellite location they were planning in Missoula. He named the people who'd made it happen, including 3 names. She didn't expect him to name people who'd contributed resources quietly without asking for recognition in the Herald way. Then he said, "I want to say one more thing about the woman this all came from. She hadn't expected this. She was not prepared for this. Evelyn Carter is 77 years old," Hector said. "She has been a widow for 4 years. She used to drive out here alone to sit in her husband's chair and drink coffee and remember. That's what she was doing when she heard us. She could have driven away. She didn't." He paused. "In 40 years in this club, I have met men who call themselves warriors. I have met men who talk about loyalty and brotherhood and doing the right thing. I have been one of those men." Another pause. "And I want to tell you that the bravest thing I have ever personally witnessed was a 77-year-old woman with arthritic hands and an old pair of bolt cutters deciding that 4 strangers deserve to live." His voice was steady, but only just. "I want to tell you that she did not ask who we were. She did not ask what we'd done or what we were. She heard people who needed help, and she came." He looked at her directly. "And everything you see here today, every person, every program, every mile someone drove to be in this parking lot, every bit of it came from that one decision." He stopped. "Evelyn, we have a name for people like you. We don't give it easily." He paused. "We call it family." 6,000 people in a parking lot. She stood there. She thought about Harold at 31 years old saying, "Now it's real." She thought about a chain link fence and rust marks and a bolt cutter handle in her arthritic hands and a young man named Danny, whose temperature had been too high and the sound his chains made when they fell. She thought about 44 years of a life built with a man who believed you keep the coffee right and you do the work and you don't spend energy on what people think of you because you don't have energy to spare. She thought about a bounty of letters almost full from people she'd never met who'd stopped at a place on the highway and found something they hadn't known they needed. She thought about Jess standing somewhere in this crowd, 17 years old and thinking about becoming a mechanic. She thought about Harold. She walked up the steps to stand beside Hector. She hadn't planned to speak, but Hector stepped back and the 6,000 people went very quiet, and she understood that this was the moment, the one you don't get twice, and Harold had taught her what you do with a moment you don't get twice. You don't waste it. She said Harold built this station because he believed that a business should give more than it takes. That's all he ever thought it should do, give more than it takes. She paused. He would be standing out there in the middle of all of you right now, learning your names. He'd know 300 of them by the end of the day and remember them all next year. I can't do that. A pause. But I can tell you that this place is going to keep giving more than it takes. Every person who drives down that highway and needs something real, they're going to find it here. That's not a hope. That's not a plan. That's a promise. She looked out at 6,000 people. Harold's promise and mine and theirs. She looked at Bear, at Hector, at Danny, at all of them. We're not done. We're just getting started. The sound that came back was not applause exactly. It was fuller than that. It was the sound of a very large number of people deciding at the same moment that something is worth believing in. She stood in it and let it be what it was. After Bear found her near Harold's chair and she'd gone inside for a few minutes, needing a moment of quiet the way you sometimes need to step out of rain, not because you mind the rain, but because your nervous system requires a pause. He came in without knocking, which was right, because knocking would have been wrong by now. He sat across from her. They didn't speak for a little while. You know what I've been thinking about, he finally said. Tell me. That day, when you were working on my locks, the second padlock, you stopped and you closed your eyes and you just breathed for a few seconds. He paused. I didn't say anything, but I was watching you, and I thought this woman is going to do this. Whatever it cost her, she's going to do it. He looked at her. I've thought about those few seconds a lot, what it took for you to open your eyes and go back to it. She thought about it too, about the pain in her hands and the heat and the particular silence of 4 men watching her and the knowledge that it mattered. Harold, she said simply, same as always. Bear nodded. He understood. He's everywhere in this place, he said. He's everywhere I take him, she said. That's how it works. You carry them in how you move through the world, in what you refuse to walk away from. She looked at the chair behind the desk, Harold's chair in its exact position, unmoved. He'll be here as long as this place is here, and this place is going to be here a long time. Bear looked at the chair. Long time, he agreed. Outside, 6,000 people filled the lot, and the highway shoulder and the field beyond, and the sound of all of them together was like weather, like something larger than its parts, like something that had gathered itself out of smaller things and become its own force. In a year, Carter's service had given free coffee to over 4,000 travelers. Gil had logged 63 roadside assists. 312 veterans had come through. 47 handwritten letters lived in a box that was now completely full, so she'd started a second box. One state legislative bill had been introduced with 2 members who'd stood in this lot on the anniversary as co-sponsors to create a formal highway way station program modeled on what Carter's service had built. And on a back road near Glacier Bear's grandfather's property had a new fence post that Bear had put in himself on a Sunday in June, working until his hands were sore, thinking about a woman with arthritic hands who had worked until her hands were sore and hadn't stopped, and the fence post went in straight and solid and stayed. Jess came into the office to find her grandmother still in Harold's chair, Bear still across from her, the 2 of them in comfortable quiet. Jess looked at them both and said, "Is there room for one more?" Evelyn looked at Bear. Bear looked at Evelyn. "Pull up a chair," Evelyn said. Jess found one, dragged it over as sat. She looked at Harold's photograph on the wall. She looked at the old mug with the tire brand on it that had been lost behind the register and found again. She looked at the hand-lettered signs. She looked at her grandmother. "Tell me more about him," she said. "Tell me more about Harold." So she did. She told Jess about the man who had built something out of nothing because he believed that building things was what you did with the time you had, who had loved with the full weight of himself without apology or performance, who had run into burning buildings not because he wasn't afraid, but because he had learned early and permanently not to make himself not do it. She told her about a man who had understood before most people she knew had figured it out, that the measure of a life was not what you accumulated, but what you gave, not in one gesture, not in one grand moment, but in the accumulation of ordinary days in which you kept choosing to give more than you took. She told Jess everything she could fit into an August afternoon in Herald Station, surrounded by the evidence of what one right decision compounds into when you give it time and keep showing up. Outside, the sound of 6,000 people carried the story forward. Inside, Evelyn Carter told it from the beginning. And Carter's service, Herald Station. Evelyn Station Family Station stood on Route 12 in Mayan, Montana, exactly as it had stood since 1979, red on white above the door, all are welcome, coffee is on, giving more than it took. That was its promise. That was what it kept. That was what it would keep as long as a Carter drew breath to keep it, and long after, because some things, when built right, outlast the hands that built them. Harold Carter had known this from the beginning. Now everyone did.